Good morning. Welcome. This is what we're talking about, using the Robo Task Runner. I'm Mark Dorison, CTO at Chromatic. Chromatic has been working with Drupal, building complicated Drupal sites and Drupal adjacent sites for over 15 years. And that is what I get to work on. We're starting off with a warning. There are going to be a number of code slides in this talk. The good news is that it's purely to show concepts. You don't need to read every line or copy anything down. Hopefully I've done a decent job of making it very readable. If you see a slide with clearly too much code on it, it will quickly move to one where we zoom in on the important areas, so don't panic. And all but a few lines that you'll see today are in public repositories that I'll mention. So if you're interested in looking more closely, you'll be able to check those out. So what's the problem that we are going to talk about today? If you're like me, you like to automate things, and you've worked on a lot of projects that end up getting festooned with bash scripts. They add up. And lots of people love bash. I use it in situations where there's not, I can't assume that there's another runtime available. It's great for that. It's relatively ubiquitous. But if we're working in a PHP project, like probably most of us here are, I'd rather use PHP. If I'm working in a JavaScript project, I'd rather use JavaScript. I want to kind of keep things correlated with the language of what we can expect when someone's rolling onto a project. This is a PHP project. If you want to work on some of these automations, some of this tooling, it would be great if it was in the same language. So what do we need? We need a PHP task runner if we're talking about a Drupal project. And in this case, Robo to the rescue. We're going to talk about Robo. So Robo calls itself a modern, simple task runner inspired by Gulp and Rake, aimed to automate common tasks. So you might already be using Robo and not know about it. Maybe you've heard about this tool. Drush is built on top of Robo. So it's likely if you're using Symphonic Drupal and you're using Composer, you're pulling in Drush, you already have Robo installed in your project, and you could make more direct use of it. Robo was first included in Drush in 2016. It first shipped in Drush 9.0. That feels like it should be relatively recently, but Drush 9.0 came out 7 years ago. Drush 12 is being prepped for release right now to put some context around that. So a lot has changed in Drush since Drush 9.0, and Robo's been there for all of that. So some of the use cases that you can use Robo for, certainly not limited to these, but automation, testing, builds and deployments, backups and restores, anything where you currently have a complicated bash script, Robo could be a good replacement for it, and probably more stuff that you're not doing yet. It gives you better access to PHP packages since it's written in PHP. If you want to, if you need to make API calls out to something, you can pull in Guzzle. We'll look at that a little bit later. And anything else like that, you can pull in all kinds of stuff via Composer, just like you do for your Drupal site. You can then use it in your tooling.
Good morning, Eric.
Better readability, both for a developer and for the user, and the logs. For the user running the calls, it's a lot easier to give great output to the command line. Better error handling, better developer experience and user experience. So, to sort of set the table, I'm going to show some of the tasks that are built into Robo. This is some of the easy things that it gives you out of the box that it's going to make easier for you. That said, you can also do anything that you can do in PHP. You're not limited to any of this stuff, but it's got great support for working with files, replacing content in files, merging files, file system options, copying directories, cleaning directories. composer operations that you can run from within PHP, so we'll look at that later too. So you can do things like run composer update really elegantly, run composer validate to make sure those composer update changes that you did, that your composer JSON file validates as you expect it to. Working with version control, if you're using Git, it also has support for SVN or HG, Mercurial. And then more general purpose stuff. So like if there's not something built in, you can just call out to the command line using task exec or parallel exec, which if you're dealing with long running operations and things that can be parallelized, this I found to be very useful and way nicer, way more elegant than dealing with the parallel commands directly. So let's talk about the typical setup if you want to use Robo on your project. All you need to do is require consolidation Robo. Again, if you're on a Drupal project and you're requiring Drush, this is already there. And all you need to do is create a robofile.php in your repository root. This is what the most basic implementation of a robo command in that robo file can look like. So you've got a class, robo file, it extends robo's task command, and then we have our command. Why is this a command? This is a command because it is a public method. Any method in your robo file that is public is going to be exposed as a command. The method name becomes your command name, and you'll see how that breaks down in a second. We have an argument for our command. We have the documentation in the doc block, and we happen to give this one an alias, and you'll see that on the next slide. And then we have an example of some nicely supported user feedback for the command line. So we're off to the races with this, and this is how it all gets parsed out. So if we just run robo, it's going to parse what it can find and expose our commands. And we see it here in the last line, hello :midcamp is our command. We have hi is the alias, and then we have our documentation that's parsed out here from the doc block to our command. And if we run this command, this is what we get. Hello midcamp 2023, our argument that we passed in. This is as simple as it gets. You can add all kinds of commands to your robo file. You can make them quite complicated. You can have helper methods. You make those protected or private, then they won't show up as public commands. And you'll start to love this. You'll add more and more, and before you know it, you'll have a robo file that's many hundreds of lines long, and it's got commands that don't really have anything to do with each other. Replacing those bash scripts, you've got things for database backups next to things for running your tests. So it starts to get a little overwhelming. If we're working in modern PHP, we're probably used to object-oriented programming. We're used to separating concerns amongst classes. So that's what I wanted to do. I got to the point where this is unwieldy. I don't want to work in this way. I want to separate my commands just like I would my classes in a module. So auto-loading to the rescue. We don't have to use that robo file. We can empty it out, add an auto-load directive for where we want things to live, and then in our repository, you can see here we've broken out a whole bunch of different commands with their own classes or groups of commands. Let's say, because each of these classes maybe they have multiple commands if they're related. So this was the next step that on my journey with this. I was like, okay, I've gotten what I wanted. Everything makes sense. It's in different classes. But then I started to realize I started duplicating this across projects. And some of these commands were specific to the project, but some of them were pretty similar, if not identical. Some of those database backups, some database downloads. So for example, with a single command, you could build your site locally, pull in the latest database, dump from production, import that to your site. I wanted a similar operation across all of our projects at Chromatic. So we created a collection of commands that we call Usher. Usher is a public repository. I use the definition of Usher to show or guide someone somewhere. It's also American singer, songwriter, businessman, and dancer, Usher Raymond. So you can use Usher. You can also build your own version of Usher for shared commands, or you could include your commands in your individual projects, and you can mix and match those too. You can have some commands that are shared and then some that are specific to an individual project. So you can require Composer Usher, and those were the three approaches. We've got RoboFile, commands within the project, separated with classes, and then we could share commands across projects. So now I'm going to go through a couple examples in a little more detail of how we have used Usher to help on some of our projects, or many of our projects. So on Chromatic projects, we build every PR in a preview environment using Tugboat. Shout out to the Tugboat folks. Tugboat is also available on Drupal.org. If you're not aware, you can enable Tugboat on any contrib project. All you need to do is add a Tugboat config file, and any merge request that's created, it will build a Tugboat environment for that. So you can then test the merge request changes, see that it built, see it in a live environment without pulling that in locally. It's really great. So when we build an environment, we want to make sure, among other things, one of the things we want to make sure is that the Drupal configuration status matches what's in code. So this is a drush command, config status, and it displays what's not in sync between the configuration in the database to the configuration that you've exported to disk. Or it'll tell you if it matches. And we wanted to run this on every PR so that while we're doing the review, before we actually do the review, before we get to approve and merge, we can have feedback that says, yes, config matches database to code, we feel confident in it, and if it doesn't, we want to mark the PR as failed. So this is what a typical PR looks like that uses this. It just so happens, I don't think I did this intentionally. It is a PR that is updating Usher, but that's irrelevant. What is relevant is down here, and is all of our checks. And the check that we're talking about today is the configuration check. So we'll also note that there is a check below this called Drupal status report, which is we're doing a very similar thing. We're using a drush command to check the state of something that's going on in the Drupal database. And in that case, it's the status report, and in this case, it's the config check. And that's important because we ended up with pretty similar bash scripts when this was originally written. So this bash script, which you don't need to read or know anything about what's going on, you should just be overwhelmed by the sight of it. And it's actually not even as complicated as it should be, because if I'll point out that at the bottom it actually is already running a robo command. So everything above, all this bash code, is just the code that talks to the GitHub API. So the actual running of the drush command and dealing with giving some good output to the command line and all that, that's already handled. But when we first implemented the integration with GitHub, it was written in bash. And then when I came along and said, I want to do a different version of this, a second for those two commands, I ended up with a lot of very similar code. And I wasn't comfortable enough with bash to abstract it easily so that it could be reusable. So I didn't want to have all that duplicate code. I didn't want it to be in bash. I wanted it to be more maintainable. This is gross. We're escaping strings. We're calling out to curl.
Have you ever tried to do JSON in Bash before?
I shudder just to think about it. So we're going to look at a few pieces of this. It is broken up now. Here we'll go through a couple pieces. We see that we have a class for validate config commands. We're using a trait, the GitHub status trait. So all of that GitHub talk communication code that was in Bash, we put into a trait so it could be shared across multiple commands. We'll see that trait in a second. We get to use things like constants, and then we get to use all of this. Then we get to use things like PHP stand to do static analysis because it's in PHP instead of Bash. So as we move on, this is our command. There's a lot of doc block up at the top to tell Robo, what it should be expecting, but really we can see all of it down here in the last 3 lines. We have our command, which is going to get parsed out to validate : Drupal-config. It is a public method, so it is going to be called out as the command. And then we have one argument, which has a default. And then we have an array of options, only one options, which is essentially gets parsed by Robo and turned into a flag. So on this command, if we run --set PR status, then it will flip from false to true, and then we can change how it's going to be executed in the code. Any questions on this slide? This is maybe a good point to. All right, good, cool. So now we move on to our trait. This is our GitHub status trait. This is going to contain all of the code that was in that messy, disgusting-looking Bash screen. And this is some of the code in that trait. So we get to see we've created some helper methods: set GitHub status pending, set GitHub status success. So for example, when this first starts to run, this gets called. It sets the PR to say that it's pending. So we know just by looking at the PR, okay, this has started, it's running. We should expect a response back, and then if it succeeds, we put some nice output on the command line. So if you're reviewing the logs, you can easily tell that. But then we actually call set GitHub status, which we'll see in a second. And there's a similar method for failure and any other states. Those are the only 3 states, I believe. So now this in the next slide shows this is the meat. This is what we replaced all of that Bash code with. And all of this is the setup. So we have our set GitHub status. We have some arguments we're passing in. We're using some environment variables, grabbing things from the Tugboat environment. These are all things that we are going to use when we call GitHub, so that we know what GitHub knows what repo we're talking about, what PR we're trying to set the status for. So it's all just set up here. Setting the base URL, what URL we're going to call. But this is the best part. We get to use Guzzle instead of curl and everything that comes with it. This is when we're actually making a request. We're taking all those items that we set on the previous slide, the URL that we're calling out to, the access token, so GitHub knows that we are allowed to set this, and then the body of the request. And then we also have nice error handling if something goes wrong. So the second example I'm going to show is one that I actually built while I was working on this talk. I was like, well, I forget what the exact catalyst of it was, but we use a lot of different environments when we're on most of our sites. So we might use Lando for local development. Tugboat, I mentioned, we use on every project. We use GitHub Actions to run up all our CI checks that don't require a Drupal database. So stuff that does require a database and a live site, we use Tugboat, but things like static analysis and CI, we run in GitHub Actions, among other things like if we need to do any custom deployment stuff. So this is a project that has a lot of GitHub Actions on it. So, but all of these environments, and also most of our projects, if they are hosted on places like platform.sh or somewhere else, these are all configured with YAML files, which is fantastic. And most of those contain the PHP version that we're running, that we want to run in. So when it comes time to make that change, we were ready to go from 8.0 to 8.1, or soon from 8.1 to 8.2. Someone has to update those YAML files in all those cases. And there's also, typically it's set in the composer.json somewhere as well. So, somebody goes, makes a PR, you've got multiple change files with 8.0 to 8.1, and I get a review request to take a look at that. I go look at the PR and I say, hey, I got a bunch of files changed. They all show strings changed from 8.0 to 8.1. But it's not so easy to remember, like, how many files we actually need to change? Is there 8 of them or 5 of them? It's easy to miss one. And all of a sudden, 3 weeks later, you're like, wait, why are we still running 8.0 in this environment? Or why didn't the README get updated that you need this version of PHP? So this to me was like, okay, this is a problem that we can solve with some tooling. So this is the entire command. You don't need to read this. I'm going to zoom in, but this is the command I wrote. And it's config update PHP version. So within this, there's a fair bit of user feedback to the command line. So if we pull that out, this is really all that's left. What I wanted to do was let people specify a number of files that where we set the PHP version, and then replace those strings from the version that it was to the version that you wanted to. So we have our command up here. It's a public method, so that is our command. We have one argument, the version string that we want to change it to, and then we have one option flag to skip composer update, and that's false by default. So we need to know what the current version is. So if we're going from 8.0 to 8.1, we need to know 8.0. And I didn't want people to have to specify that when they call the command. So we're going to store that somewhere. I'll show that in just a second. So we get the current version, and then we get the config, the paths where we want to check. So those are the two things that we need to, the two inputs that aren't provided by the user when they call the command. And those look like this. We store those in a YAML file, in a robo.yaml file. And this is important for sharing across projects. So if you weren't going to share this across projects, or didn't want to, you could just put this in your command. I think probably the first version of the command that I wrote just had these in an array, and then we would loop through them. But I wanted this to be able to run on all of our projects. So it got moved to Usher, and then we show that, set for whatever project you're on, set the config paths, put whatever you want in here. We have a README, composer.json, and all those YAML files that we were just referencing. So then we go back to the command. This is really it. This is all that it's doing. It's inside a loop for those config files, but all we're doing is using one of Robo's tasks, which we called out earlier in the talk, replace in file, giving it the path, the current PHP version, 8.1, and the version that we would like to update it to, 8.2. This was a little bit extra just for composer.json. So if one of those files is composer.json, and we change the references to 8.1 in composer.json, we want to run composer update for the lock file to make sure that, because the hash is going to change in composer.lock, so I wanted that to be included as well. So as long as we haven't said skip composer update, if someone does run it with skip composer update, we'll output that and move on to the next file. But if they haven't, we find the composer.json file, we run again, using Robo's composer update task with the -- lock option. And then we run the validate command just to make sure that it likes what has been done. And this is what it looks like. We're ready to move from PHP 8.1 to 8.2. So we pass in 8.2, it detects that it's set to 8.1. Here to limit some of the output, I skipped composer update, but then it shows you all the files that have been changed and how many items have been replaced. And it's nice, I like it. This is what it looks like. If it doesn't go so well, you tell it 8.1, it says you're already on 8.1. And we get some clear feedback for what's going on and what's gone wrong. Questions on any of that? So here we've used Robo to replace bash scripts. We've moved Robo commands into classes. We've shared commands across projects, and then we looked at two examples, Drupal config validation and PHP version changes, but I'm sure you can imagine a lot of others and how that could be, how you could share that code across different ones. That's the meat of it. I will be around later for BOF time. If anyone wants to look at more of these Robo commands or questions, I'd be thrilled to show them off and go through it with you. This is some unrelated promotion. If you don't know, we have a new podcast, the Drupal 7 End of Life podcast. It is not so much about the technical side of what you need to do to move off Drupal 7. That is well documented. This is more about what life is going to be like for folks who are still on Drupal 7 at or after the end of life date, and understanding sort of more of the less technical implications of having 400,000 sites still on Drupal 7 and as we approach end of life date. It's been super interesting for me. I thought that we wouldn't have that much to talk about, and we've had already great interviews with Arena Zaks and Tim Lennon, and we already have a couple more lined up, so it's been great. I have stickers for this too, if you're interested. And that's it. Does anybody have any questions?
Oh, sorry. I just have a comment.
Yeah.
I know you were talking about at the very beginning, like Drush is built on it, or uses it.
Yep.
So does we've been using the BLT, BLT project, and that was my first introduction to the Robo commands as well. And yeah, it's way better than Bash scripting.
Good question.
I was wondering if you ever do some analysis before writing the commands to think about what's the level of effort between making these automated commands versus just continuing manually updating. Is there like a level of effort where you would make a decision to go one way or the other?
That's a great question that I don't have an easy answer for. I think I kind of respond to pain, and where things have become painful, I try to put myself in the shoes of all the different users of the project. So the person who is writing these commands is often not always the target user of the commands. So I am, much more typically by trade more back-end focused and clearly more DevOps focused. I often try to think about someone who is more front-end focused and what their experience is like coming onto a project or using a project. So what are the things, and maybe they're even not super Drupal-y, for example. What are the things, we have so there's a number of commands that we use on our projects that are related to, I kind of alluded to this at the beginning, related to just setting up the project locally. So running Composer install, downloading a latest version of the database, importing that database, running Drush deploy. Those are all things that if it was just for me, I didn't write those commands for me. And so it's a number of commands that are then wrapped up in one Uber command. So they can clone a repo and then essentially run a single command and then have a running Drupal site when that command is done. I didn't write that command for me. I was like, oh, this is fine for me. I know the 6 commands I need to run to get this up and running. I wrote it for the less Drupal-y people who are working on the project so that they would feel confident, okay, I know enough of this, but I can be confident I can run a single command, and I know I should have, if everything works as expected, I should have a running Drupal site with config imported and the database update hooks run and all of that stuff. So I try to think about those people when I'm running the commands. And I think there's a bit of it that's just like,
It's done.
I think there's a bit of it that's, you just have to believe it a little bit. Like if you believe that it's going to save time and effort and expense, like, deep down, I think, like, if, whether it's worth it. Yeah, I don't know if that's like.
No, I think it's a very good perspective, especially to be thinking about not just the backend developer and whether it saves some time, but all the people who will be using it.
Yeah, and also about building confidence and being like, okay, like the change PHP config command, that that's not a complicated operation. We're talking about a find and replace or something like that. But maybe there's someone who's like, well, if you did a find and replace on that project, the example project that I was showing that has that command, the string 8.1 appears a lot of other places beyond even in just like SAS files and things like that. It showed up in all kinds of strange places. So I'm like, okay, you could write some documentation that says the things that command contains. It could say change it in these files and all that stuff. But again, how many times do you go through that and somebody misses one, and then the developer time spent going back and forth on the PR? It's like,
and if it's applicable to multiple projects, that becomes.
Yes. So and that's actually something that is worth calling out. That project that drives a lot of some of these commands is a very complicated project and has a number of developers working on it, and so it has that project drives a lot of the worthwhileness of creating these commands. Well, it's worthwhile to create it for this project. Now, if it makes sense to build it for that project, but then we get to share it across all of our projects, even the projects that are really tiny and don't have a lot of hours allotted to them, then we can become way more efficient on those projects. We can spend our time on more valuable things that are delivering more value, more impact to our clients. And so that's where I think if you can approach it in that way, it goes beyond just the individual project, the individual implementation of where it's created. So that's what I get excited about.
It's BLT with a different opinion. That's not always bad.
We have no shortage of opinions. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah?
What are some of the limitations of Bravo? Because I was thinking like Behat, and I know there are certain things for when you want to use it, but maybe you want to use PHP unit or something else. And I imagine Bravo fits its own kind of category when it comes to like automation, where you might be like, oh, I tried doing this in Bravo, but maybe I should do it in something else just to have a performance increase. Or for some reason, maybe that side is not as developed.
I think, the items you mentioned, like Behat or what was the other thing?
PHP unit or anything.
Yeah, so we call out to all those things from Bravo. So we're triggering our, PHP CS, PHP stand, PHP unit, all from robo commands. Those are very simple robo commands, but it all runs through robo. So people, because we have this kind of full suite, they can run similar commands for all of these things. And so this is kind of like the robo is like the orchestration piece of like what we're calling out to.
Right.
But to answer your original question, like when would it not make sense? I think,
I mentioned Behat because there's multiple solutions you can have for testing, and I imagine for Robo there might be like multiple solutions that you can have in different levels of the stack. So at which point you like go all the way down to Robo, and at which point there might be like another solution that is close by, but it's a higher level, and you might switch to that instead. If that has come across, because you might have seen some of that while digging into it.
Not, I don't know specifically if I have, but I think there's a balance and there's a value in consistency too. It's like, well, this is just the way we do it, so everyone knows, okay, this is where we look, this is where the commands are stored, this is the tool we use for this. And if there is another way to go about it that is significantly better in its approach and its results, absolutely we should do that. But if it's relatively comparable, consistency wins in a way, so that we know where all the bodies are buried and where to find things.
It's good.
So that's what works for us, but your mileage may vary.
And that's great.
And just to circle back to what I said at the beginning, and it kind of relates, like where Robo doesn't make sense is where, for me, is when PHP is not readily available. So I don't want to have to install PHP in an environment just to run Robo commands. I want to run Robo and use Robo because I'm working with PHP already. So that sometimes gets tricky when you're dealing with projects that have multiple stacks. So if you have a PHP stack and a JavaScript stack, separately within a project, sometimes that doesn't matter if the environments have both of those things. But sometimes if we're talking about containerized environments, they don't necessarily have all those things. So for me, it's really gone the other way, but it's, in our setups, it's sometimes you're in an environment where, we need to build a JavaScript. We need JavaScript to build a theme, for example. And we use our front-end team will build all of that with a JavaScript task runner. But then again, Robo sits above that and calls, when we build it into our workflow for like spinning up the entire site, that's part of what Robo does. It calls out to that piece. Now, that could be troublesome if you're like, well, we don't have JavaScript in this environment, or a Node, for example, in this environment. It's a PHP. Well, okay, what do we do? Do we install Node in this environment so that we can build the theme here? And so sometimes, occasionally, we'll run into that. But yeah. Anything else? Awesome.
One more thing.
Yeah,
Is there an equivalent for JavaScript when it comes to Robo?
Sorry, what was it?
Is there an equivalent in JavaScript? Like,
Rake, I think, or what was the one that Gulp?
Yeah.
I think so. Gulp, yeah.
Webpack.
so maybe
Right.
Yeah, there's no shortage, I think.
I'm wondering.
Yeah, it's the question of what
How
you're.
many hundred words we can
Yeah.
spew out.
Yeah.
Was it a debate
I thi-
internally between Rake and Gulp?
Of course. I think there's I think the ecosystem is actually much more broad in the JavaScript community for tools like that. I haven't seen like 20 alternatives to Robo for PHP task runners, for example. But you do see that in JavaScript.
That's good too.
Yeah. All right, that's it.